Sarah Chen stared at the gleaming spires of Armstrong International Academy, their crystalline surfaces refracting the morning sunlight into prismatic patterns across the courtyard. 3 years after the Centauri Accord, this was humanity's grand experiment, the first truly integrated human-alien educational facility on Earth. And today, it felt more like a prison than a school. The 3 Centaurian students stood at the top of the main steps, their iridescent scales shifting colors in a display that Sarah had learned meant amusement. Tall and elegant, with 4-fingered hands and eyes that seemed to capture light like black apples, they were considered royalty among their kind. Vexthor, the leader, flicked his primary tongue in what passed for a smile among his species. Sarah clutched her tablet closer to her chest, its surface cool against her fingers. The device contained her latest mathematical proofs, work that had earned her a full scholarship to this prestigious institution. At 16, she was already taking university-level courses in theoretical physics and multidimensional calculus. But none of that mattered to the Centaurians. To them, she was just another primitive human, barely worth acknowledging except as entertainment. "Look who it is." Vexthor's harmonics rippled through the air, a sound that always made Sarah's teeth ache. The little calculator. His companions, Mirax and Zen, shifted their positions to block the entrance more effectively. Sarah had learned early on that showing fear only encouraged them. She kept her breathing steady, her face neutral, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Excuse me," she said quietly, moving to step around them. Mirax's hand shot out, faster than human reflexes could track, knocking Sarah's tablet from her grasp. It clattered down the steps, its screen cracking on impact. "Oops," she trilled, her secondary scales flashing patterns of mock concern. "How clumsy of you." Sarah stared at her fallen tablet, watching as her work, months of calculations and theory, flickered and died behind the spiderweb of cracks. She felt something shift inside her, like numbers realigning themselves into a new equation. The Centaurians might understand advanced mathematics, but they had never learned to calculate the danger of pushing someone too far. "You should be more careful," Zen added, his voice carrying the multi-tonal resonance that marked Centaurian aristocracy. "Primitive technology is so fragile." Other students hurried past, their eyes averted. Humans and aliens alike had learned to stay clear of Vexthor and his friends. Their families held significant positions in the Centaurian embassy, making them practically untouchable under the careful diplomatic balance of the Accord. But Sarah wasn't thinking about diplomacy as she descended the steps to retrieve her tablet. Her mind was already working, processing variables, and computing probabilities. The Centaurians communicated through mathematical patterns hidden in their scale coloration, a language they thought too complex for human comprehension. But Sarah had spent months secretly studying these patterns, recording them, breaking down their mathematical basis. As she picked up her damaged tablet, she noticed something interesting in Vexthor's scale patterns. Beneath the obvious display of dominance, there was another pattern, one that spoke of fear. Fear of failing to meet expectations, fear of losing status, fear of being found inadequate. The revelation almost made her smile. They weren't untouchable after all. They were just equations waiting to be solved. "Thank you for the reminder about careful handling," Sarah said, her voice steady as she stood. "I'll be sure to remember that. About all kinds of fragile things." She met Vexthor's gaze directly, something humans rarely dared to do. For a moment, his scales shifted in a pattern she hadn't seen before. Uncertainty, perhaps, or confusion. Then his secondary membrane slid over his eyes, dismissing her as irrelevant. "Come on," he said to his companions. "We're wasting time with this primitive." As they disappeared into the school, Sarah remained on the steps, her mind working faster than ever. The Centaurians had taught her something valuable today, something they never intended. Every system, no matter how complex, had its vulnerabilities. Even their mathematical language of dominance could be turned against them. She pulled out her backup tablet. She'd learned early on to keep duplicates of everything, and began making notes. Not about theoretical physics or multidimensional calculus, but about scale patterns, behavioral frequencies, and social algorithms. She would solve this equation too, step by careful step. The bell rang, its tone modified to accommodate both human and Centaurian hearing ranges. Sarah gathered her things and headed to class, already calculating her next move. The Centaurians thought humans were simple creatures, easy to intimidate and control. They were about to learn that sometimes the most complex solutions came disguised as simple variables. And Sarah Chen was anything but simple. The quantum physics lab hummed with energy as Sarah worked late into the evening, officially analyzing wave-particle duality experiments. Unofficially, she was doing something far more interesting. Her damaged tablet lay dissected on the workbench, its cracked screen now a gateway to understanding Centaurian technology. Cross-referencing pattern Alpha 7, she muttered, fingers dancing across her functional tablet surface. The screen displayed cascading columns of numbers, recordings of Centaurian scale patterns translated into their mathematical equivalents. 3 weeks of careful observation had yielded fascinating results. The Centaurians didn't just communicate with their scales, they used them to interface with their technology. Each subtle color shift, each ripple of iridescence carried data. Their supposedly superior devices weren't activated by touch or voice, but by mathematical sequences expressed through bioluminescence. Sarah's breakthrough had come during yesterday's quantum computing class. Vex Thor had been showing off, as usual, interfacing effortlessly with the advanced Centaurian equipment. But Sarah noticed something odd. A slight delay between his scale patterns and the machine's response. The system wasn't reading his biology directly. It was reading the mathematical sequences he was generating. A sound in the hallway made her quickly minimize her work screens. Dr. Martinez, her quantum physics professor, poked her head through the door. "Still here, Sarah. It's getting late." "Just finishing up, Dr. Martinez," Sarah replied, gesturing to the conventional experiment setup nearby. "Wanted to verify some calculations." The professor smiled warmly. "Your dedication is admirable, but don't forget to take care of yourself. And," she hesitated, "if those students are still giving you trouble, you can always talk to me." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "Thank you, but I'm handling it." She waited until Dr. Martinez's footsteps faded before returning to her real work. The next morning, Sarah arrived early, positioning herself in the courtyard with a clear view of the school's main entrance. Right on schedule, Vex Thor and his friends emerged from their private transport, their scales shifting in patterns of smug superiority. Sarah activated her modified tablet, its sensors now calibrated to detect and record Centaurian bioluminescent frequencies. As the trio passed, she captured every subtle variation in their scale patterns, every mathematical sequence they unconsciously generated. During lunch, she found a quiet corner in the library to analyze her recordings. The patterns were complex, but they were just mathematics. And mathematics was Sarah's native language. She began to see structure in what had initially appeared random. Social hierarchies expressed in geometric progressions, emotional states mapped to specific numerical sequences. Most importantly, she discovered their authentication patterns, the unique mathematical signatures they used to access secure systems. Like passwords made of light and numbers, but far more sophisticated. Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. They were so convinced of their superiority that they displayed their security credentials openly, never imagining a primitive human could decode them. But her work was interrupted by a commotion nearby. Mirax had cornered a younger human student, her scales flashing patterns that Sarah now recognized as expressions of contempt and amusement. "What's wrong, little human? Can't interface with the library system?" Mirax's voice carried that familiar harmonic mockery. "Perhaps you should stick to your paper books." Sarah watched as the young student tried to access one of the Centaurian data terminals, his hands shaking. The bio-interface was rejecting him, of course. It was calibrated for Centaurian users only. A small crowd had gathered, some recording the scene on their tablets. Something shifted in Sarah's calculations. She had been planning to take her time, to build her case slowly and carefully. But watching another student face the same humiliation she had endured sparked a new variable in her equation. That evening, after everyone else had left, Sarah returned to the library. Her modified tablet contained hours of recorded scale patterns, including the specific sequences Mirax had generated while accessing the library systems. With careful precision, Sarah began to replay these patterns, using her tablet to emit the exact same mathematical frequencies. The library terminal hummed to life, recognizing what it thought was authorized Centaurian access. Sarah's fingers flew across her tablet, navigating through layers of alien code. She wasn't just accessing the library. She was learning how their entire network operated. By the time she left, Sarah had discovered something interesting. The Centaurians kept detailed records of their interactions with human students. They documented every incident of bullying, every act of humiliation, sharing them among themselves like trophies. They thought these records were secure, accessible only to their kind. They were wrong. Sarah walked home through the gathering darkness, her mind already formulating the next steps in her plan. The Centaurians had built their system on the assumption that humans couldn't understand their mathematical language. That assumption was about to become their greatest vulnerability. Tomorrow, things would begin to change, not with confrontation or complaints to authorities, but with subtle manipulations of numbers and code. Sarah would teach them an important lesson about underestimating their primitive human classmates. After all, every equation needed balance, and it was time to add some new variables to their perfectly ordered world. The changes began subtly at first. Vexthor's personal terminal started experiencing random glitches. Nothing major, just small inconveniences. Files would mysteriously reorganize themselves, settings would reset, and occasionally, his authentication patterns would take multiple attempts to register. Sarah watched from across the quantum computing lab as he grew increasingly frustrated, his scales flickering in patterns that expressed confusion and anger. She had spent weeks perfecting these intrusions, making them appear as system anomalies rather than deliberate attacks. Something wrong? Zen asked, his own scales shifting in concern as Vexthor failed again to access his project files. This primitive equipment, Vexthor snarled, his harmonics sharp with irritation. The integration with Earth's power systems must be causing interference. Sarah hid her smile behind her tablet. The real interference came from her carefully crafted algorithms, which monitored Centaurian communications and introduced calculated disruptions. Each glitch was a mathematical symphony, designed to stay just below the threshold that would trigger system security alerts. But technical inconveniences were just the beginning. Sarah had discovered something far more interesting in their secured files, evidence of a sophisticated cheating network. The Centaurian students weren't just sharing answers. They were manipulating the school's grading systems, ensuring they maintained their academic superiority over their human classmates. During lunch, Sarah retreated to her usual quiet corner, but this time she wasn't alone. A small group of human students had begun to gather around her, drawn by whispered rumors that she understood Centaurian technology. "Is it true?" asked Maya, a sophomore who had recently failed a Centaurian language exam, despite weeks of preparation. "Can you really read their patterns?" Sarah studied the group carefully. She saw in their eyes the same frustration and determination she felt. "It's all mathematics," she explained quietly. "Their language, their technology, their whole system of interaction, it's based on mathematical sequences. Once you understand the patterns." She pulled up a display on her tablet, showing the transformed data from her recordings. The students leaned in, fascinated by the cascading numbers and graphs that represented Centaurian communication. "But we can't generate their bioluminescent patterns," someone pointed out. "We don't need to," Sarah replied, her fingers dancing across the screen. "Their system accepts mathematical input in any form, as long as the sequences are correct. They just never bothered to tell us that." Over the next few days, Sarah began sharing her knowledge selectively, teaching other human students how to access Centaurian systems using modified tablets. She was careful to emphasize discretion. This wasn't about revenge, but about leveling the playing field. Meanwhile, her main algorithm continued its work. Every time the Centaurians used their cheating network, it logged the activity, every discriminatory comment they made in their private channels, every instance of them abusing their access privileges. All of it was being carefully documented and categorized. The breaking point came during the quarterly academic assessment. Vexthor and his friends had planned their usual manipulation of the results, but this time, something went wrong. Instead of altering their grades, the system locked them out completely. Worse, it began displaying their true scores, significantly lower than they had been reporting. "This is impossible." Mirax's scales flashed patterns of panic as she tried repeatedly to access the system. "The calculations are perfect." Sarah watched from her workstation, outwardly focused on her own assessment. Her algorithm had chosen this moment carefully, waiting until the Centaurians had already submitted their manipulated data before revealing the truth. The commotion drew the attention of Dr. Martinez and other faculty members. As they investigated the system anomaly, they discovered not just the immediate discrepancy, but the entire history of academic fraud. "These records go back months," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying a mix of disappointment and anger. "Every test, every assignment." Vexthor's scales had gone almost completely dark, a sign of extreme distress that Sarah had never seen before. "There must be some mistake," he insisted, but his harmonics wavered with uncertainty. Sarah continued her work quietly, but she felt a subtle shift in the classroom dynamics. Other human students were sitting straighter, their expressions showing a new confidence. The Centaurian's aura of superiority had developed its first real crack. That evening, as Sarah compiled the day's data, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The equation was balancing itself, but she wasn't finished yet. The academic fraud was just one component of a larger pattern she intended to expose. Her tablet pinged softly, alerting her to new activity in the Centaurian communication channels. They were panicking, trying to understand how their perfect system had failed them. Their scales flickered with patterns that spoke of fear, anger, and, most importantly, dawning realization that they weren't as untouchable as they had believed. Sarah began the next phase of her calculations. It was time to show them exactly how much power they had inadvertently given away with their careless display of mathematical arrogance. After all, in mathematics, as in life, every action had an equal and opposite reaction, and Sarah Chen was about to demonstrate just how equal that reaction could be. The school's atmosphere had shifted dramatically in the weeks following the academic assessment incident. Vexthor and his friends still walked the hallways, but their usual swagger had diminished. Their scales now frequently displayed patterns of anxiety and uncertainty, emotions Sarah had never seen them express before. But they weren't defeated yet. If anything, the exposure of their academic fraud had made them more dangerous, like cornered predators. Sarah noticed their scale patterns becoming more erratic, expressing sequences she interpreted as desperate planning. "They're up to something," Maya whispered during lunch, sliding into the seat beside Sarah. They'd been meeting in the old physics lab after hours. "Something about a demonstration." Sarah nodded, already aware of their activities. Her monitoring algorithms had captured fragments of their communications, enough to piece together their plan. The Centaurians intended to stage an incident, one that would prove their technological superiority and restore their damaged reputation. What they didn't know was that Sarah had already infiltrated their private planning sessions. Their secure communications were an open book to her now, their mathematical signatures as clear as printed text. She knew exactly what they planned to do: sabotage the upcoming interspecies science exhibition. The exhibition was meant to showcase collaboration between human and Centaurian students. Teams had spent months preparing demonstrations of integrated technology. It was a symbol of everything the school stood for. and exactly the kind of high-profile event that could reshape public opinion. Sarah spent her evenings in the quantum computing lab, preparing countermeasures. Her fingers moved across multiple tablets, weaving complex algorithms that would lie dormant until needed. She wasn't just defending against their planned sabotage. She was setting up her own demonstration. The day of the exhibition arrived with an atmosphere of nervous excitement. The school's main hall had been transformed into a showcase of human Centaurian innovation. Parents, diplomats, and media representatives filled the space, moving from display to display. Sarah watched as Vexthor and his group positioned themselves near the central demonstration platform. Their scales flickered with patterns that spoke of anticipation and malicious intent. They thought they were about to prove once and for all the humans were technologically inferior. The moment came during the keynote presentation. As Dr. Martinez began explaining a breakthrough in quantum communication, the Centaurian students activated their devices. The lights flickered, and the demonstration equipment began to malfunction. As you can see, Vexthor stepped forward, his scales gleaming with practiced patterns of authority. Earth's power systems are simply inadequate for advanced Centaurian technology. Perhaps we should reconsider the wisdom of this integration experiment. But before he could continue, something unexpected happened. The malfunctioning equipment stabilized, its displays showing not error messages but data. Very specific data. Records of every discriminatory incident, every manipulated test score, every private communication plotting against human students began playing across the screens. Sarah's algorithms had been waiting for this moment. As soon as the Centaurians attempted their sabotage, they triggered her countermeasures. Their own security protocols, their private channels, their supposedly unbreakable encryption, all of it unraveled before the assembled crowd. What is this? Mirax's scales flashed patterns of panic. How is this possible? The audience watched in stunned silence as the evidence continued to stream across the displays. Parents gasped at recorded incidents of bullying. Diplomats frowned at clear violations of the integration protocols. School officials saw the full extent of the Centaurians' manipulation of academic systems. Then Sarah stood up. "It's possible," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the quiet hall, "because you never considered that humans could understand your mathematical language. You thought your patterns were too complex for our primitive minds to comprehend." She held up her tablet, displaying the transformed data streams that represented their communication patterns. But mathematics is universal. Every pattern you displayed, every sequence you used to assert your superiority. We could read them all. We just needed time to learn the language. The Centaurian students' scales had gone almost completely dark, a sign of absolute shock. Their carefully constructed world of superiority was crumbling around them, exposed by the very mathematics they had used to maintain it. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her expression a mix of disappointment and resolution. "I think we need to have a serious discussion about the future of our integration program," she said, looking pointedly at the Centaurian students and their parents. As the hall erupted in conversation and demands for explanation, Sarah remained quiet, watching the equations play out to their natural conclusion. The balance was shifting, but this wasn't quite the end. There was one more calculation to make, one that would determine whether this moment led to further division or genuine understanding. Because Sarah had learned something important during her months of studying Centaurian patterns, beneath their displays of superiority, they were capable of change. And sometimes, the most complex equations resolved themselves in unexpected ways. In the days following the exhibition, Armstrong International Academy seemed suspended in a state of uncertainty. The Centaurian embassy had launched an official investigation. Parents demanded answers. Students of both species watched each other with new awareness. The old power dynamics dissolved into something undefined. Sarah found Vexthor alone in the quantum physics lab after hours, his scales displaying patterns she had never seen before. Complex mathematical sequences that spoke of confusion, shame, and something that might have been regret. "You could have exposed us at any time," he said without looking up, his harmonics stripped of their usual arrogance. Why wait? Sarah set her tablet down carefully. Because the goal wasn't to humiliate you. It was to show you something you refused to see. She pulled up a display of transformed Centaurian communication patterns. Look at these sequences. Your language, your mathematics. They're beautiful. Complex, yes, but not because they're superior. They're beautiful because they represent an entirely different way of understanding the universe. Vexthor's scales shifted, displaying interest despite himself. You truly understand our patterns. I understand that mathematics is universal, Sarah replied. When you first came here, you could have shared this knowledge, could have taught us to read the patterns. Instead, you used them to build walls. She brought up another display, showing the overlapping mathematical structures of human and Centaurian computational systems. Look at how they complement each other. Different approaches to the same universal principles. We could learn so much from each other if we stopped trying to prove who's superior. The lab fell silent except for the hum of equipment. Vexthor's scales slowly began to shift, displaying patterns that Sarah recognized as deep thought. My family, he finally said, his harmonics carrying a new note of vulnerability. They expect perfection. Superiority. The idea of learning from humans. He trailed off, his scales flickering with conflicting emotions. And now? Sarah asked quietly. Before he could answer, Mirax and Zen entered the lab. They stopped short at seeing Sarah, their scales automatically starting to display threatening patterns before catching themselves. The embassy investigators want to see us, Mirax said to Vexthor, then hesitated. They're talking about sending us back home. Sarah stood up. Before you go, I want to show you something. She activated her modified tablet one last time, but instead of displaying their exposed secrets, it showed something else. A new mathematical language she had been developing, one that combined human and Centaurian approaches to quantum computation. This is what real integration could look like, she explained. Not one species dominating the other, but both contributing their strengths. The patterns are stronger together than apart. The three Centaurians gathered around the display, their scales shifting in synchronized patterns of amazement as they recognized the elegant fusion of mathematical principles. You created this? Zen asked, professional interest overriding his usual disdain. I had good teachers, Sarah replied with a slight smile. Even if they didn't know they were teaching. The moment was interrupted by Dr. Martinez entering the lab. Ah, good you're all here, she said, taking in the unusual gathering. The school board and the embassy have reached a decision. They all turned to face her, human and Centaurians alike holding their breath. Instead of separation, they want to try something new, Dr. Martinez continued. A true integration program, with students of both species teaching each other. Sarah, your work has shown us what's possible when we combine our knowledge instead of competing with it. She looked at the Centaurian students. You have a choice. You can return home, or you can stay and be part of building something new, something better. Sarah watched as Vexthor's scales displayed a complex sequence of calculations, weighing options, considering possibilities, processing change. Finally, he turned to her. Could you, he began, his harmonics carrying unfamiliar notes of humility, teach us how you decoded our patterns? Only if you teach us how to truly understand them, Sarah countered. And there, in the quiet of the lab, surrounded by the hum of quantum computers and the glow of mathematical displays, a new equation began to take shape, not one of dominance or revenge, but of genuine exchange and growth. The next day, when Sarah entered the school, she found the dynamics had shifted again. The Centaurian students were showing human classmates how to read basic scale patterns. Human students were explaining their mathematical notations to interested Centaurians. The walls weren't completely gone, but they had windows now, and those windows were growing larger. Sarah smiled as she walked to her first class, her tablet humming softly with new calculations. Sometimes the most elegant solutions came not from defeating an enemy, but from transforming them into something unexpected, into allies, into teachers, into friends. After all, in the grand equation of understanding, every variable had its place. It was just a matter of finding the right balance.